to try to real quickly, oh, look at that, a green light.
Right, isn't that nice?
That's perfect. That looks much more promising.
On and off mute.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Okay, so we're going to start out this one. I need my reading glasses for this one. This is a Far Side cartoon. I don't know if you remember the Far Side, Gary Larson. It says God at his computer. And you'll have to excuse the image of God here. But here's God sitting at the computer, finger poised over the smite button, debating as this poor soul walks underneath the piano, right? So it's kind of a humorous image of God. But there's, like any kind of humor that we have about God, there's a little grain of truth in it, right? Because we have to wonder, is there some great big smite button in the sky that God is sitting there, making split-second decisions about what happens to people? These days, I don't think most of us believe that, but that the Bible that we hold so dear comes from a tradition where there was some of an understanding like this, right? Especially the earliest stories that we have, they come from people in the ancient Near East. And in those traditions, a lot of their neighbors would have come from like Greek and Roman religions. We might have read Greek and Roman myths, right? In which sometimes the gods are kind of capricious. They like to play around with humans. They like to sit up on the mountaintop and kind of toy with humans. And so the people who are writing the Bible, they've heard these stories and they must wonder, is this how God operates? Right? Because the world in those days would have seemed pretty random. Would have seemed pretty scary. I mean, for us, the world often seems random. So imagine living in a time when you don't understand weather patterns, you don't understand health, you don't understand mental illness, a lot of the things that we now have some rational explanations for that can exist alongside our faith and our understanding in God. And so people were trying to make sense of when bad things happen. Where is God in all of that? And I think the best example of this in the Bible comes from the book of Job. So if you remember the book of Job, it's a story, and it starts out like a bit of a fairy tale. There once was a man named Job who lived in the land of Uz. And so it starts out as a story. But in this story, Job and his family are blessed with everything they could possibly want for a joyful life. And a character known as the accuser, or in Hebrew, Satan, a character known as the accuser challenges God and says, Job only loves you because Job has a really good life. Job is only faithful to you because you have blessed Job with all this wealth and a beautiful family and all the good stuff. And so this accuser challenges God to take it all away from Job and see what happens. And that's exactly what happens. And Job's situation gets worse and worse and worse until Job is left with nothing. And still everyone is trying to explain to Job, oh, Job, you must have done something wrong. There has to be a reason that God would curse you like this. Unhelpful. Everything happens for a reason, Job, right? So unhelpful explanations. And eventually God speaks to Job and basically says, Job, I'm God, you're not. So there's no way that you could be expected to understand how I work. And then at the very end of the book of Job, there's a final chapter that scholars believe was actually added later. So the idea is that the original book of Job was just a complete downer. It ends with Job deprived of everything. But in this epilogue that was added, God restores Job's fortunes, gives him beautiful children, more beautiful than the ones who died, gives him more possessions, more plentiful than all those taken away, and everything is restored. So here's an example, from a very early time, of people so desperate to understand why bad things happen that they would tell a kind of fairy tale in which God is playing a game with humans. And so we have to, when we come across something like that in the Bible, we have to wonder, like, well, what do we do with this story? And what's interesting is that Christian traditions, or even individual Christians, will do very, very different things. I have preached on this story a number of times, and I've preached it along the idea of everything happens for a reason, not being helpful, right? The idea that we try to make up reasons, and at the end of the day, we don't know. And so our call as Christians is not to try to explain the unexplainable. It's to try to point to this loving God who is present in all of these things. So I preached a sermon when I was in seminary on Job along those lines. A year later, a different student preached a sermon, and she came from a very different tradition. She preached on the exact same passage, and her message was, well, when bad things happen to us, it may be that God is trying to test somebody else, right? And so, like in this story of Job, Job's children all died. Maybe that was because God was trying to test Job, and you can't have testimony without test. And so when something bad happens to us, we can't make sense of it because it might be that God is using us as part of a test for our own faith or someone else's faith. Now, with all due respect to my colleague, if pastors could be sued for malpractice, I would have sued. I find that very unhelpful. But it is rooted in many of our faith traditions. And so she wasn't saying something that she had made up herself. She was saying something that had come out of her own faith tradition. And she was saying it with great sincerity and faith and intending to spread the good news that day through her sermon. So I think this is where we have to be really cautious, right? Because when we are kind of out in our worlds, and we are in some ways trying to speak for God, we want to be careful about what we say, right? We want to make sure that we first do no harm. That we are leading with God's love and not with explanations for how God might be at work. But I think I tell that story to start us off because it does show the struggle that we have, right? That when we don't have good answers, we might tend to make up some answers. And if we're going to try to come up with some explanation for how God works, let's use the Bible and let's use our tradition to guide us in the most helpful way. So that's what I want to do here with thinking about what is it that our tradition does tell us about God and how God works. And so I pulled a couple of words that are consistent. We talk about God Almighty, right? I believe in God Almighty. And sometimes we hear that God is immortal, right? That God is eternal. We hear that God is immutable, a fancy word for unchanging, right? God has always been God and will always be God. God is omnipotent, right? That God's power is unlimited, and that God is in charge of everything, and that God is omniscient, which means that God is all-knowing. So we hear those in the Christian tradition. Someone outside the Christian tradition, I have a quote here from the movie Love and Death, said, well, if it turns out there is a God, I don't think he's evil. I think the worst you can say about him is that basically he's an underachiever. So this is someone looking at all the evil in the world and saying, God, I think you could have done better in trying to prevent all of this evil. So that's what we have to struggle with when we say that God is omnipotent, that God has unlimited power, and we say that God is omniscient, God is all-knowing. Then we have to ask, if God is these things, why is God allowing bad things to happen? Why is God allowing evil on a cosmic level? And so I wonder, do these words resonate with you? Are there Bible passages or hymns or things that come to mind that you say, yeah, they are reinforcing for me that God is all these things? Yeah, does something...
The very first one.
Yeah.
Immortal.
Yep.
I can sing it for you.
Well, that was, I thought, yeah, Immortal, invisible, God only wise, right? In light inaccessible, hid from our eyes, right? The idea that we can't understand God, but we know that God is immortal, invisible, and wise, right? Yeah, anything else come to mind? A Bible verse or a hymn? But this is all pretty consistent with what we hear, right? We hear God says, "For surely I know the plans I have for you," right? God is all knowing. We have hymns that tell us that. We have, in a very comforting way, the words of Psalm 139, right? The idea that wherever I go, God has gone before me. God knows where I'm going to go. Even if I make my bed in Sheol, God knows, right? Those are words of comfort to remind us of that. Yeah, Maddie.
I feel like somebody in this room said this to me recently, but the Bible verse about, or it's not a Bible verse, is it? It might be a Bible verse, something beside it.
Yeah.
Man plans and God laughs. Like God knows what the real.
Yes.
And we just sit here and are like, well,
Right. Right. Yeah. And that might be one of those things that is like we think is a Bible verse, but isn't. But there's a lot that, right? Well, for now I see through a mirror dimly, but one day, like the idea that when we as humans can only see part of it, but God can see the whole picture.
Many years ago,
Yeah.
Neil Rostin wrote a book called The Joys of Yiddish. And according to him, it's an old Yiddish saying from Eastern Europe.
Nice.
Man plans and God laughs.
Right.
It's in Proverbs. And based on the experiences of the Jews during the pogroms in Eastern Europe, it makes a lot of sense.
Right. Right. Absolutely. I mean, and there's something beautiful about that, right? The idea that we don't need to micromanage everything, because at the end of the day, there is a certain randomness. But then the idea that if our lives go well, it can be really comforting that God laughs because God had something even better in store for us than what we could have planned. But when life is not going well, it can be potentially hurtful to say that to someone, right? So this is what we're kind of struggling with. And we struggle with that because of this idea of God Almighty, right? If God is all powerful, we have to ask, can God control everything and everyone? Does God use God's power to make everything happen? And so if we say yes, then we have to wonder, well, does that mean that God causes the bad things? Or do the bad things just happen and God lets them happen, doesn't interfere? And this is something thousands of years people have struggled with. One of the answers that this is kind of an enlightenment idea, is this idea of deism, right? The idea of deism very much rooted in the idea that there is a God. Because for a long time in sort of Western civilization, most people believed in God. So of course there's a God. So the question is just, what do we do with that knowledge that God exists? And so deists firmly believed, yes, God exists. God created the universe, but God doesn't get involved. And they compared creation to a watch at the time being one of the more complex forms of technology, right? A watch is beautiful and intricate and was very clearly and thoughtfully designed. But once the watchmaker makes the watch, they give it to us and then their hands are off. And so this was a very popular theory during the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, especially because there was this big emphasis on reason. So they thought, if you look at a watch and you see how cleverly it's designed, that was their analogy to saying, well, we can look at creation, we can look at the world, and we can see how cleverly and thoughtfully it's designed. So from that, we can infer that, sure, there's a creator, but that creator isn't necessarily somebody interacting with us. And so because of that, deists tended to not be real interested in the Bible or other religious texts. And sometimes there was a little bit of a kind of just picking and choosing going on. I don't know if you've ever heard of the Thomas Jefferson Bible, but Thomas Jefferson, Christian founding father, but he cut out of the Bible anything that he considered supernatural. And he had his own little notebook of the Gospels that was just the sort of wisdom of Jesus as a good teacher, but none of that supernatural resurrection miracle kind of stuff. He didn't believe in any of that. And so even though I don't think we find too many people nowadays who say, oh, I'm a deist, I think there are probably actually, a number of people who, if you ran this by them, they'd say, yeah, that kind of sums up what I believe. I do believe that there was probably some creator of the universe, and that creator did a great job, but I don't necessarily believe that I have a personal relationship with this creator as a loving being. And so that's why, there's some things we learn from deism, but ultimately we as Christians would not say that we're deists. So then there's kind of the next step in this, and this is what we would call process theology. And this is the idea that God has a will in everything, but that not everything is the will of God. And so the process theologians would say, well, God has unlimited power, but God uses that power to persuade, not to coerce. So we as humans have free will. God is not this puppeteer pulling the strings, controlling what we do. God is not controlling the strings of the universe either. God isn't making thunderstorms or lightning bolts or anything like that. The idea that the whole universe has free will, nature has free will, humans have free will, and therefore everything is always in flux and everything is always changing. And so everything operates according to these parameters set out by God, but God's not making it happen. And so there's a lot of process theology that's very appealing, right? And also that kind of resonates with us. There's the idea that even though God is eternal and God's power is eternal, the idea that God is also changing, right? And we do see some evidence of this in the Bible. The idea that Abraham could argue with God, right? And kind of try to argue on behalf of the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, right, in order to change God's mind. We have stories in which people are interacting with God, and we in our prayers sometimes argue with God because there's this idea that God can be changeable. But in process theology, the characteristics of God don't change. God is always going to be powerful, loving, good, and wise. But how God acts is something that changes. Now, there's again a lot about this that is really appealing. And what's different here from some other ideas is that even though God is all powerful, God is also self-limiting. So God could do anything that God wants, but it's God's choice not to. It's God's choice not to make us do the right thing all the time, even though it would mean that the world was a lot better and that there was no room for evil. So this is, again, there's a lot about this that's appealing, I think, for that reason. Any questions before we keep going? All right. We're going to look at one more theory that is a little bit close to this, and this is sort of the cousin, I would call it, of process theology, and this is open theism. It's the idea that in a multiverse world, God doesn't know what will happen. Now, I don't think this is quite like multiverse, like Marvel multiverse, if you've seen the Doctor Strange movies. I think that's a theory that exists so that they can make as many movies as they want, because they can always come up with an alternate reality. But there is a little in common with that in the idea that, well, there's no single fixed path. And so therefore, every decision that someone makes can open up a whole new universe of activities, right? And so because of that, the idea is that God actually doesn't know what's going to happen, right? And that's where people kind of get a little worked up sometimes about open theism, right? If you are an open theist and you want to work as a scholar, I would keep the open theism part to yourself, because there have been a lot of highly public situations where scholars have been fired for saying this very thing, for saying that God doesn't know what's going to happen. because that doesn't imply, that says that God is not truly omnipotent, right? That God doesn't know what's going to happen. It still says God is powerful. It still says God is eternal, but the idea that God doesn't know what's going to happen is troubling to a lot of Christians. It implies that God is not who we thought God was. So that's probably the most controversial explanation. I'm going to kind of take us to where I think God operates. So are there any questions before I do? All right, here's where we get into the idea of when bad things happen to good people. And Rabbi Kushner says, can you accept the idea that some things happen for no reason, that there is randomness in the universe? And I think this is, even though Rabbi Kushner is not an open theist, I do think he has some beliefs in common. And it comes from his own personal experiences. So this book has become so famous. And that phrase, when bad things happen to good people, has kind of just entered the conversation, even for people who haven't heard of Rabbi Kushner or read his book. But he came to write this book because of his own suffering within his family. He wrote this in the early 80s, and he and his wife had a child who was born with a congenital defect. And so they knew that their son, Aaron, he was diagnosed when he was like a year old. So they knew that he was not going to live a long life. And they knew that he was going to suffer because of this illness. And their beautiful son ended up dying around the age of 14. And so Rabbi Kushner and his wife had really like 13 years to live with trying to make sense of, okay, here's this rabbi who's like, God, I have served you. I have given my life to loving you and sharing your love with other people. I am a good person, right? I'm doing all the right things, and yet something so bad is happening. Why? And then Rabbi Kushner started realizing that, this was a key part of the conversations he was having with so many of the people in his synagogue. And that people were so uncomfortable with the idea of the universe being random, that they would rather think that they were terrible people than think the world was random. A couple who had lost a child saying, Rabbi, we didn't fast on Yom Kippur this year. Do you think God is punishing us? Right? That people were doing so much harm to themselves and to each other, right? Because we say these things to each other as well. And Rabbi Kushner, tells a story about a young man who had a terrible accident. One of his friends came to him in the hospital and said, you had a really good life. You were getting a little cocky. I wonder if God wanted to teach you to be more humble. Right? Imagine get out of here. Yeah, it sounds like one of Job's comforting friends, right? Like coming, because we're so uncomfortable with the idea that the world is random and we can't always make sense of it. So even if it hurts, the idea of saying, well, there must have been some plan. And that's where we have this image here of the tapestry. Sometimes the analogy that people use is to say, well, our lives are tapestries, right? And God is weaving the tapestry. We're only seeing the underside of the tapestry, and the underside is pretty ugly. It's got frayed edges and knots and all kinds of mess. But when you turn it over, which we will one day do in heaven, you see the beauty of the tapestry, right? The idea of we see through a mirror dimly, but one day we will understand. Again, I suppose that can be comforting to some people, right? But when we're going through hard stuff, the idea that, well, this is just going to be what happens, and someday in heaven it'll all be worthwhile, maybe not so helpful, right? We want to know right now, where is God in all of this? Why are these bad things happening? And that's where Rabbi Kushner ends up. And he ultimately rejects all of these kinds of explanations and says, if life is random, can we take comfort in this all-loving God? And now what Kushner says that is a little bit different from where the Christian tradition ends up is that Kushner actually does say, you know, God can't fix everything, right? That God's power is limited. And we in our tradition tend to say more, well, God has the power. God chooses not to use the power in that way because of all of the complications of doing so. And that's what we see here. You might not remember this movie, Bruce Almighty, where this average guy, God wants to take a break and gives this average guy, Bruce, the job to fill in for God while God is taking a break. And so Bruce is like, well, this can't be that hard. And so he takes all of the prayer requests coming in and he files them away. And then he just like clicks a button and is like, yes, answer yes to all the prayers. And he very quickly realizes how crazy that is. Like everybody has won the lottery, but like everybody gets a buck because everybody has won, right? Like just, you know, silly things start to happen because it's a comedy. But the idea that, you know, when we see it in a silly way like that, it becomes pretty obvious that God can't really operate like that, right? And so we say, well, if we believe in God Almighty, we can believe that God is all loving and that God is also self-limiting. And so that's where we have this idea that God doesn't answer yes to all of our prayers, but that God does answer our prayers. And it even leaves some room for miracles, right? So miracles are one of those tricky things. I can see why Thomas Jefferson might want to cut them out of the Bible because they open all kinds of questions, right? If God can perform miracles, why does God not perform my miracle, the miracle that I would like to see happen, right? Which is a very reasonable question. I have some thoughts on that. Before I do, I want to open it up, though. Is this something that you struggle with at all? Have you witnessed a miracle or have you experienced something that you see as miraculous? Or are you comfortable with miracles were kind of a biblical thing and we don't see a lot of miracles these days?
You know, Mark Twain had one son, two daughters, he had one son, died of diphtheria. And the boy was about 10.
Okay.
And Twain wrote an essay about Noah. And his question was, how could a loving God allow two houseflies on the ark whose descendants would come and take the life of a beautiful little boy? Because even at that time they understood that diphtheria was spread by houseflies.
Yeah.
Where does that, what would something like, and Twain eventually died a bitter old man who never did reconcile with that.
Yeah.
But where would that fit into this? Where it's all loving and self-limiting, and this goes back to a established story in Scripture.
Yeah. Yeah. So how much time do we have to unpack that, John? Yeah. So a couple of things. First off, we even in Twain's time, people probably took the Bible much more literally than we do now, right? So now we might look at a story of Noah's Ark in a similar way that we would look at the story of Job, right? That it was, we look at it, we say it could have been a literal event, but it also could have been a way that people made sense of the fact that there were random storms, that there were floods, that it was really scary, that they wanted some kind of assurance that this kind of tragedy would not happen again. And so even though attributing that tragedy to God is scary, the promise of the rainbow and God's covenant that this will never happen again was a way of providing comfort to people. So that's the first part of that. It doesn't explain why the heck are there houseflies that carry horrible diseases? Why malaria is borne by mosquitoes? Why the heck do we have mosquitoes, right? Why do we have ticks? Why do we have any of these critters that can why would God allow that to happen, right? And, there's no satisfactory explanation. If I was sitting with a grieving Mark Twain, I would not be like, okay, well, let me explain the way nature works and that these flies do some good things and some bad things. With that, I would really just try to sit with him in his sadness, in his suffering, and say, can we find some comfort from this loving God, knowing that this loving God is here with us. But to the idea of why was the universe created in such a way, I think there's two possible explanations. One is that there are all these critters that do harm and also do good, and so the universe needs both to, exist. And then the other possibility is that a lot of things have evolved in ways that, because of human interaction, problems have become worse or greater, right? There are creatures that cause harm to humans. Once upon a time, humans lived very separately from those creatures, and it wasn't a problem, right? But through the activities that humans have done, through the way we've introduced pesticides and other chemicals that have changed the way things, that we have kind of created all of these situations that have evolved in such a way. And that was part of, by sort of giving us the free will to do all of that, God kind of left it open to those kinds of things happening. Again, if I were with Mr. Twain, I would probably start with, there are no words. There is no way to explain this. And let's sit together in this pain. Yeah. Thank you. That's a very real example. Yeah, go ahead, Maddie.
Yeah, I'm thinking about miracles, and I remember at some point working here, some sermon I was working on, and I was writing it, and I was writing something about, maybe it was around, maybe I preached about Lazarus or something, and because it was about resurrection, I remember saying something, wanting to type something in the sermon that was I believe that the dead will rise, something like that.
Yeah.
I was I don't know if I can, should I say that up there? And I was I'm scared to say that.
Yes.
Wrestling with well, I do believe that, but if I say it,
yes.
What will people
yes.
be receptive to that idea? Right? That's a huge miracle that we say
yes.
over and over and over again corporately, but when you have a conversation about it,
yeah.
it's in the weeds, right?
There was a church just a couple of years ago, sort of a church, a very evangelical church that believed very much in if you pray and you're a good, faithful person, God will answer your prayer. And there was a pastor's child who got sick, and the whole church was praying, and the child died. And so the church changed their prayers to asking God to bring this child back from the dead. And they prayed this for several days before finally, deciding not to pray that anymore. And I think that's right. So we can look at the story of Lazarus and we can say, yes, God is capable of doing that. And in this very particular situation, Jesus did raise someone from the dead because it was a way for Jesus to show people who he was and the power that God had, and to point to God's power in a very particular way. But at the same time that Jesus was living on this earth, there were numerous people who died, and Jesus did not go and resurrect every one of them from the dead. And so that's kind of a tough thing to sit with, right? The idea that God is capable of miracles, but God is not going to always perform miracles can be really hard. And so you were right to wonder how will this sit? It's tricky. Yeah, you look. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Doesn't he just, but does Jesus say, or when Mary came to get him the first time to come to Lazarus, that he said, well, we got to wait for a few days so that I can raise him?
Yes.
And it was done with supposedly the purpose to just for the show.
Yeah, I mean, Jesus, that makes Jesus sound a little calculating, doesn't it? But it's true. But Jesus wanted him to be dead for 3 days so that everybody could know for sure, for good and certain. And then Jesus did this so that people would come to believe. And that was true with, Jesus, we would say, why are there hungry people when Jesus took a few loaves of bread and fish and fed 5,000 people? Well, again, even while Jesus was alive, There were hungry people who were not fed that day. And it's not to say that Jesus was picking and choosing or being mean. It was to say that Jesus' miracles had a very particular purpose, and it was to point to God. So the miracle that he performed, it wasn't necessarily because everybody needed more wine at a wedding, and that's why Jesus turned water into wine. It was because Jesus wanted to go big and show God's abundance in a really powerful way. And so by sort of transcending the laws of nature, that was a powerful way to point to God. You had a, yeah. So yes, you, please, sorry.
Well, and these miracles that we read about also were written down after the fact, and the embellishment of oral tradition.
Yes.
And so whatever happened, it just became more and more miraculous as it
Yes.
went along. So it comes down to, again, do we literally read the Bible, or do we more rationally?
Yeah, I think I hear your point, because right, these stories were written down many times, 30, 50, or even more years after. And so when we can read them, not we can read a story like that and say something miraculous did happen. Whether it was quite as grand as the story says, we don't know. But what is it that the teller of that story wanted us to know something? And it was something about God and God's power and love. It might not have been about how big the water vats were and how much wine was produced. It was more, they wanted us to know, wow, God is an abundant God who gives in large quantities, right? So that's what that's what we kind of take away from some of these stories. Yeah.
Well, like every time there's a natural disaster or an earthquake or something, and they'll go through, and all of a sudden, oh my goodness, there's been one live person, buried under all this rubble. Well, is that going to be like something that people would say, oh, that was a miracle? I mean, to me, it's just an amazing stroke of luck.
Yeah.
That person actually
Yeah.
survived it. But if you wanted to, you could embellish that to be some miracle concerned with that person.
Well, and certainly people do, right? We hear that sometimes. And again, like if you're the person who survived an earthquake and to you that was miraculous, I am not going to be like, I don't think so. I totally understand, but it can be harmful if we look at, 500 people were killed in a tragedy and then someone survived, and if we all point and say, oh, what a miracle. Well, so did God have the power to save that one person and had the power to save 500 more and chose not to save 500 more? It can be that can be very, very harmful to people. And so at the end of the day, like if you experienced something in your life that felt miraculous, I am never in a million years going to try to persuade you otherwise, right? But I also think we have to be careful in what we put on other people, right? The idea that your loved one did not experience a miracle, but I did, or my loved one did, can be really harmful. Is that consistent with what you're saying, or did you want to say something else, some more?
I don't want to say.
Okay, I want to make sure I didn't take what you said and go off in a different direction. So all of this is to say, right, we don't have good explanations for Mark Twain, for somebody, an earthquake survivor. We don't have the perfect explanation, but we do have some helpful ways that we can look through this. And so the idea that what if we just look to Jesus, right? And we look to the example of Jesus, and we look at Jesus as an example of God being with us rather than God working for us. That comes from Samuel Wells, who's a vicar in London. I absolutely love his writing. And he talks just really poignantly and beautifully about the way that God is present and the way that God provides care for us. God may not provide the answer that we want, but that God is providing care for us. And sometimes we experience that. If we're really, really fortunate, we experience that in a personal, mystical way. Sometimes people, have had moments, whether in illness or at a bad time, or whether, out on a beautiful mountaintop, or just in the day-to-day of hearing God's voice or feeling God's presence in a particularly powerful way. Sometimes we have that experience. Sometimes we don't, but we feel like we can experience God's love through others, whether it's through all the good, lovely humans in this room, the way that you care for each other, or the way that Maddie or Tom or Susan cares for you, ministers to you. All of these are ways that we can experience that. And we see that through Jesus, right? We see that through the idea that even though when we talk about Jesus and we talk about Jesus coming to be with us, we immediately often skip real quickly to Jesus' death. Right? Even in our creeds, we'll sometimes say, he was born, he suffered, he died. Like, okay, hang on. Before he suffered and died, 90% of Jesus' life was being with other humans, experiencing what we experience. And that this is something that Jesus chose. So we start to struggle with that, of course, right? Because we don't know. The Bible's not very clear about how much did Jesus know. Did Jesus know that he was going to suffer and die in this way? We think that he knew that at the idea of the transfiguration, somewhere not too long before he actually died. But we presume that Jesus had a choice, right? That when he was praying on the night before he died, he had a choice, and that this was something he chose to do. We also then question, well, was this God's plan, right? And again, we looked at a few different kind of theories, different ways of understanding how God works. Some people say from the beginning of time, this was God's plan. God knew when God created the heavens and the earth that at some point God was going to send Jesus, and Jesus would suffer and die. Other sort of theologies will tell us, it wasn't necessarily God's plan that Jesus suffer and die, but what does God do? God works with whatever God has, right? So when bad things happen, God is in the mix. God is working. God is trying to bring something good out of something terrible. And so out of Jesus being killed, Jesus being executed, God is working miracles. And through that, God is using what happened to Jesus as a way to bring all of us, all of humanity, all of creation into God's saving love and saving grace for all eternity. And so that is a way of understanding how God works in the mess, in the tragedies. Another way of making sense of that, this is something that you might have heard in the news, because Mr. Rogers, of course, my personal favorite Presbyterian minister, Mr. Rogers, he's been quoted a lot lately as saying, when I was a child and I would see scary things in the news, my mother would say to me, look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping. And so this is another reminder of how God works. Now, I'm not a big fan of silver linings, right? When something terrible happens, COVID was terrible, but look at the silver lining. Okay, not real helpful if we have lost a loved one due to COVID, or if we suffered from COVID, or if we just, felt like our lives were really, really awful for a short period of time. So this isn't about silver linings, but it is about saying that God will work in the bad stuff. When I taught confirmation a number of years ago, one of the girls said, well, my mom told me that God allowed September 11th to happen so that we would all learn to help each other. So that has really stuck with me, because I don't find that helpful, right? But it's kind of the flip side of this, right? The idea that, and we were so bad at helping each other that God had to make something horrific happen so that we would learn to help each other. Not helpful, but something horrific happened. It was awful. It was devastating for a lot of people. But there were people in the midst of all of that who found an extra amount of goodness and helpfulness and generosity, and they rose to the occasion. And many of them were sacrificing their own safety or their own health or well-being, but people rallied and helped each other. And so this is the idea that God is at work through us and in us when bad things happen. I want to leave time for a couple last questions, and I want to give you time to get to worship. Next week, we're going to delve much more into, today we started kind of big picture. Next week, we're going to get a little bit more nitty gritty with the personal, God at work in our own lives. So before we let things rest today, are there questions or responses to what we've talked about?
The end result of that 9/11 really was more hatred.
So by that thinking that, if what was the quote earlier? It's not, that God is evil, God is an underachiever. If God was using 9/11 to teach us to help each other, it did more harm than good, is what I hear you saying there. Yeah, so that's,
Girl's mother who's saying,
it's not a very credible theory on that.
yeah, because you sit down and think, wow.
Yeah, I hear you on that. Yeah, but that's the challenge, right, of trying to answer questions that are unanswerable. The question, why did 9/11 happen? We can point to all kinds of literal reasons that it happened. People did this, political situations, the history of regions of the world, etc. But none of those are satisfactory, right? And so at the end of the day, I think we can kind of shake our heads and say, I don't know. I don't know.
They're more satisfactory than trying to have some supernatural explanation for it. I think you go back and look at the history and all of that.
Yeah.
There's very logical reasons for
Yes.
things that happen like that.
Yes.
And the response is very logical too, no matter how much damage our response did to it. That's very, very, easily, or not easily, but it's very explainable.
Yeah. I think you're right. That's why I like this idea of when a tragedy happens, you said there are when tragedies happen, people universally do rally and they do help. And it doesn't make the tragedy worthwhile, but it does allow us to, if we're trying to look and say, okay, where is God when bad things happen? The idea that we can look to the compassionate response of people, of Christian people, of people of faith, of people of no faith, right? That people everywhere have an innate goodness that makes them want to help. We can look at that and say, oh, that's part of how God made us, who God made us to be, as people who compassionately support one another. So one way that we see God at work in all that. I think we probably have time for one last question or comment. Well, I'm going to stand at the door here and I'm not going to call it homework. I'm going to call it an opportunity to read something if you would like. You'll need an opportunity. You'll need your reading glasses for this one. But next week we're going to hear from Kate Bowler, among other people. And this is an article that she wrote in the New York Times a number of years ago. So I'll invite you to read it, and I'll stick around in case anybody has one-on-one questions. Thank you. Thank you so much.